I sent you a text. It's total mess.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to welcome you to this very special event. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. This is the 27th year of the Glenbard Parent Series. And if you haven't taken a look at our offerings, I encourage you to go to the website and see the list of incredible thought leaders who will be coming to us virtually and just about every single week and sometimes twice a week. So find the programs that speak to you and please do share it. Let others know that now that we're virtual, we are really well beyond the walls of Glenbard, and we have so many sponsors and so many partners that are from not around the corner, and we're thrilled about that. And speaking of sponsors, you saw the slide. We could not do it without them. Our annual sponsors on the cover, our additional sponsors on the back. Thank you so much. This is an important topic for an important time, but before we get to it, let me just tell you very quickly what's going on the next few weeks with GPS. So next week we are welcoming Susan Cain. She will be speaking about her book, The Quiet Power and Secret Strength of Introverts. This will be the first time she's been with us. She will be speaking at noon, be in conversation with Dr. Mark Brackett, the author of Permission to Feel. And then at 7 p.m. Central Time, she'll be talking to Bruce Feiler, the author of Walking the Bible, Secrets of Happy Families, Council of Dads, Life in Transitions. So join us either at noon or at 7 p.m. And then after that, we'll be welcoming Catherine Perlman. If you are the parent of a child in 4th grade or 3rd grade or 5th grade, this will be of particular interest to you. The title is A Pre-Tweens Guide to Digital Responsibility, Safety, and Etiquette at noon again at 7 p.m. on October 25th. So I hope you'll join us. And then kind of following up to Becky Sadler's program last week, Valedictorians at the Gate, we will be welcoming Ned Johnson, Matt Pietrofelli. Ned is the author of a book called The Self-Driven Child. So he'll be talking about test-taking strategies. That is his line of work. And so I hope you will come back for that. And then following week is an early childhood program. Dr. Stephanie Carlson will be talking about shaping executive functioning skills in the early childhood. So if you're a grandmother or a grandfather or a parent or a teacher or a caregiver, these programs are for you. It is a tremendous pleasure to welcome back a long-standing friendship will be honored today. Madeline is really my role model. I have taken so many of her wise words to heart and shared them ad nauseum for many, many years. Let's turn it over to Emily Tamaru, who is the superintendent of Community Consolidated School District 89, who will introduce Dr. Levine. Take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Gilda. It is an honor to introduce Dr. Madeline Levine, an experienced psychologist with over 35 years of experience as a clinician, consultant, educator, and author, whose books have been translated into multiple languages. Her New York Times bestseller, The Price of Privilege, explores the reasons why teenagers from affluent families are experiencing epidemic rates of emotional problems. Her follow-up book, Teach Your Children Well, also a New York Times bestseller, tackles our current narrow definition of success. And her most recent book, Ready or Not, focuses on how to best prepare our children and ourselves for an uncertain and rapidly changing world. Dr. Levine is also the co-founder of Challenge Success, a project at Stanford's Graduate School of Education, providing families and schools with the practical research-based tools that they need to raise healthy, motivated kids capable of reaching their full potential, which is what we want for all of our kids. Dr. Levine is highly sought after as a lecturer for parents, educators, and business leaders, both nationally and internationally. She is the frequent go-to person on issues for caregiving and for both print media and radio. We are so honored, privileged, and thrilled to welcome her back to the Glenbard Parent Series today. Without further ado, Dr. Madeline Levine.
Wow, thank you so much for all the kind words. I will do my best. I miss being there. And your audience will have to forgive me. I've been speaking so much that I don't have much of a voice. So you'll hear me coughing and stuff. I don't have COVID or anything. I just have a raggedy voice. I know today's topic is about the straight line and the squiggly line, and I will get to that. Excuse me. But before I get to that, I feel like I can't start speaking without acknowledging not only how difficult it has been, but how difficult it continues to be. We like to think we're in a post-pandemic stage. Thank God we are to a great degree. And Gilda, who I listen to, told me to be optimistic, which I generally am. But I also think the lingering effects of COVID are sort of under-recognized. You know, we feel like we've come out of this really difficult time, but the statistics are disturbing. So rates of mental illness have continued to be really high. Getting a therapist has become a full-time job because people are so busy now. And I don't want this to be only about the children, because my take on parent-child relationships, you know, I'm like an expert on children. I'm a developmental psychologist. But the one thing we really do know is that children co-regulate with their parents. And so to the extent to which the parents are doing okay and the teachers are doing okay, it's likely that the children will be doing okay as well. And I feel like there has been a tremendous amount of attention paid to the challenges and mental health issues of children, primarily, parents to a pretty great degree, and teachers minimally. So if you're out there as a teacher or administrator, I was looking at the statistics before I got on, and I think it's 300,000 teachers have quit. And I think have not been adequately attended to. And I was a teacher. That's how I started out. I consider it the toughest profession there is. 300,000, I found my note. And so attending to ourselves, whether we're parents, grandparents, which I've become, teachers, administrators, is every bit as important as listening to talks about what we need to do for our children. And what we need to do for ourselves is very similar to what we need to do for our children. And that is to self-regulate, to develop a larger skill set than we had. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So when COVID started a million years ago, and I spend a lot of time in my office. I'm kind of an introvert. I write, and so I said to myself, well, that's great. You know, I'll have 3 weeks to do a lot of writing. So I wrote for 3 weeks, and that was not the end by a long shot. And so that gave me an opportunity to think of about the fact that I had a particular skill set, which was kind of verbal and writing and stuff like that. But that wasn't going to be enough to take me through what at that point promised to be a very extensive period of challenge. And, you know, I just thought about, well, what's been missing? I've raised 3 children with my husband. I've had a big career. I didn't have as much time as I would have liked for friendships. And that became my task over these 2.5 years, was to attend to that. And it has been one of the most important things I've ever done. And I think part of that is, remember in the beginning of COVID, everybody, including me, no doubt, was telling you to go bake or have a massage, you know, self-care. I remember I used to say, go in the bathroom and scream in a towel, because we had no clue how long this would be, how devastating it would be, how many people would die from it. So I think we had kind of a trivial set of self-care suggestions. And you know, I like a good massage as much as the next person, but I think what I learned was that self-care is largely about relationships and community. And that was brought home to me in a very particular way. So you can't see out my office, right out my office here. I'm in San Francisco. I have a little garden. And over the first year and a half, because we were closed down for quite a long time in San Francisco, I had this stream of kids who would come visit me masked at 6 feet in the garden. Depressed, you know, kids, I would say from about 15 to 20, late teenagers, mostly early adults. And the complaints were the same, either from the kids or the parents. They were depressed, they were anxious, they had no meaning, they were isolated, which was a huge deal for kids and older kids, by the way. Anybody with older kids, the group of kids who were just getting ready to go out in the world, I think they were the most impacted, because they were at a stage where being home with mommy and daddy was not salutary, was not helpful, and their sense of isolation was very great. But anyway, I'd sit in the backyard with this stream of kids who were down, you know, smoking too much dope and not getting out of bed, playing video games. And they ended up doing pretty well. And I'd like to think that they did pretty well because I'm such a good experienced psychologist. But here's the reality. After I talked to these kids, there were probably 8 or 10 of them for a couple of weeks and nothing much changed, I decided that they didn't have much meaning in their lives. And so I made a list of places in San Francisco that needed help: Jewish Children and Family Service, Catholic Family and Children's Service, Meals on Wheels, a whole bunch of things. And my deal with the kids was, if you want to continue to see me, you have to pick something from this list of service agencies, and you have to spend 2 to 4 hours a week being of service. And I cannot overestimate the impact that that had on kids' mental health. So it was not a brilliant interpretation. It was nothing like that. It was helping them in a period of great uncertainty and meaninglessness. You know, nobody knew what was going to happen. And so there's no greater threat than an unknown threat. Helping these kids to have a sense of purpose beyond themselves was the most helpful thing I think I've ever done as a psychologist. And that changed my opinion about what I needed to do for myself in terms of starting to feel better. So as I said, I decided I was going to work on my friendships. I was going to work on a sense of community. I was going to do some volunteer work. And all of that was profoundly helpful to me and to these kids that I treated going through COVID. And I want to be really clear every time I talk that COVID just made clear how many different Americas are in America. So some kids were impacted in ways that were absolutely awful and will take a very long time to repair. And the kids that I was seeing here in San Francisco, I don't want to call it a bump, that sounds too trivial, but for the most part, kids in working class, middle class, affluent communities, I think will get through this. Even in situations, it's worth knowing, of real PTSD. You know, your best friend has his head blown off in Afghanistan. 2/3 of those people recover, the person standing next to him. And that's severe trauma. So I think most of our kids are well on the way to recovery. The rates of emotional problems are still higher for them, for us, for teachers, than they were pre-pandemic, but they are coming down from the very high rates we had during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we had 40% worldwide of people having either depression or anxiety or substance abuse issues. So that's coming down some. And I think it will continue to come down. I think the other thing about this is, like, we don't have any practice in living through a pandemic. And, you know, I kind of remember in the beginning of the pandemic, when I was asked to speak, people wanted, you know, the scientific evidence of what would be helpful and what wouldn't. And I didn't have it. Nobody had it. And even now, I was just looking up the pre-pandemic numbers. We don't have the science yet because we haven't lived through a pandemic and a financial meltdown and 1 million dead countrymen. So in a sense, we're all kind of flying by the seat of our pants a little bit, not entirely, because there are some things that we are well aware of as being helpful. And I want to talk about the things that we do know, both for ourselves and for our children, because I really believe that this idea of co-regulation it's critical to understand that sets the tone and the mood, not just for you, not just for your relationships, but for your children's mental health and development. So I think we have to think about, to start, before I talk about kids at all, I think you have to start by thinking about what your narrative is going to be about this period of time. What's the story you're going to tell? Because this will be a story to be told in 10 and 20 and 50 years from now, and 100 years from now, I think. So I think you have to think about what your narrative is going to look like. And with a lot of my patients, we do that together so that kids are able to start putting together a story about what happened and what it felt like, and ultimately what gave this period of time meaning enough to sort of make our way through it. It's been a great, if you're fortunate, it's been a great opportunity to think about values and, you know, what makes a meaningful life. Look at what's happening in the work world, right? That's really changing, and people are working from home, and there's a whole new paradigm. There's a new paradigm in education, the concept of belonging. Emily mentioned challenge success, and we were always about helping kids in schools, but we've added the concept of belonging, because the research is pretty compelling that kids who feel connected in school, who feel that they belong in school, have much lower rates, you name it, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, promiscuity going forward. And that part of that came out of the fact that we had to find what was working for kids during this period of time. And I have to tell you, both Gilda and Emily, I smiled this morning when I looked at the title of the talk, you know, the squiggly line, because I felt like I have been talking about that line for a decade. And I bet that a lot of your audience knows something about it. That is basically my research and thinking that there's this huge myth out there. And the myth is that successful people go to school, know what they want to do, get really good grades, graduate with honors, go on to an Ivy League school, and that's how you build a successful life. And in fact, it's, for some people, there's some small percentage of people actually who that works for, but the vast majority of people have very different trajectory. And I have fun with my co-founder at Challenge Success, because we used to speak a lot together, not as much anymore. And she's a Harvard, Stanford gal, and I'm a State University gal, and we did this together. So it's neither a certainty that will lead to a successful life, and it's not certain that it won't. When I travel around, I put those two lines up on a chalkboard, and no matter where I've been in the world, including places like Hong Kong, the number of people who feel that they took a straight line to success always comes in under 10%. It usually comes in at about 3 or 4%, leaving the vast majority of the rest of us, 95%, who have had a squiggly path. So I've been talking about that for a very long time. And I think people have more or less understood that the incessant pressure on kids for grades and performance-based achievement can be difficult. And I want to be so clear that this is not a call for lowering standards or anything like that. I'm sure I've told this at Glenbard before, or on the North Shore anyway, of I was once attacked on Amazon or something, and they said, you know, Dr. Levine, you're just lowering standards. And that cracked me up because my husband's a Jewish surgeon, what the boys in my family, my 3 sons, like to call the real doctor in the family. And I'm a Ph.D. And like, we're not known for low standards. You know, it's not part of Jewish culture to be lowering standards. So that cracked me up. So this is not about lowering standards. It's actually about setting the environment where children are most likely to be able to do well. Because we know, again, from research, you know, Stanford's a pretty researchy kind of place. We know from research that to the degree to which children feel stressed and driven to perform, they're more likely to run into emotional problems. And why? I'll give you one example. So I had this really brilliant kid who was in high school taking advanced calculus. And his father was just so anxious about this kid's performance that the father insisted on graphing the kid's performance. They've got daily quizzes, so the father would graph it every day. Kids in advanced calculus, like, really? Couldn't he graph his own stuff? And why would he want to on a daily basis? Anyway, so they come to see me. Why? Because the kid has trichotillomania. He's pulling out his eyebrows and his eyelashes and the hair on his arms and stuff. And I'm talking to the dad and him, and I said to the dad, you've got to stop this. You know, how he does on a daily basis is making him unbearably anxious. And this is his coping skill. And the dad says to me, I'll stop it when he gets into MIT. Well, the reality is he won't stop it when he gets into MIT, and he may not get into MIT. He may end up on a psych ward or at least in intensive therapy, because he didn't develop 2 things. He didn't develop the coping skill to deal with stress, right? Because it was all outside of his control. And he didn't develop his own ability to judge his progress. And that's if you're going to go to college, you've got to be able to face how you're doing, what you need help in, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. So that's just an example of why the straight line so often doesn't work. It does sometimes, like I said. My brother is a veterinarian. He wanted to be a veterinarian since he was 3 years old, and he is. I came to be a psychologist from being a teacher, the hardest job I ever had, a recreational therapist, a social worker. It kind of, you know, took some time to figure out what I was good at and what I loved doing. Now, given that we've just come off a really, really difficult emotional time, whether you've been terribly impacted or impacted to a lesser degree, if you're still worrying about whether or not your kid is going to get into whatever school you've decided is the school that will make their life, please knock it off. This is not the time to be graphing, this is a metaphor, your child's grade on a daily basis. We absolutely need to make sure that kids feel seen and heard. They're four S's: seen, soothed, stable, and secure. That's Dan Siegel's work and Tina Bryson's work. And if a child feels those four things, seen, secure, stable, and soothed, outcomes are really good. That's where our energy needs to go, along with helping kids to return to kind of a homeostasis, to get back into being able to regulate themselves. Because what I'm hearing at schools is when there's a greatly increased need for services, and there's not enough people providing those services, and people are thinking really hard about how to manage that. I know, and I've been practicing actually, Emily, for 40 years now. I know if I need to find a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker, it's a long wait. So we need to come up with ways to make mental health workers more available. There's a proposal in California so that you go to college for 4 years, but the last 2 years are for a social work degree. And I actually think that's a very good idea. We're just going to need more teachers, more doctors, more nurses, more mental health workers. Okay, so what else can we do to be helpful to kids? I want to talk for a minute about resilience. Like, who made it through this and who didn't? If you didn't die or if you weren't very sick. And I talked to a lot of people about resilience over the last few years, and I think people have a very mixed up idea of what resilience actually is. Are some kids more resilient than others? I think they are. The expression I like is genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. I've had 3 kids. Are they equally resilient? No, in the same way that kids are different in every way, empathy and self-control and stuff like that. But if genetics loads the gun, it's still environment that plays a very large role in developing empathy and all the things I just listed, including resilience. So how do we make our kids more resilient? And just pull back just for a minute and think about the fact that resilience is not an all or none. People are not equally resilient in all situations. So I had a kid who got through her parents' divorce really remarkably well. She was rejected from the college of her choice, and she completely fell apart, needed to be hospitalized. So you can be resilient in one situation and not in another. But in general, we can promote resilience in our kids. And that's really what I would like to talk about, because I think it's something we can do today. I think you've heard enough about the crooked line, which I think is, the straight line is particularly not important at the moment, but resilience is. And so how do you make kids more resilient? One of the things I think that really, really gets in the way of kids' development and young people's development is what I call in my latest book, in Ready or Not, accumulated disability. And that's the impulse that all parents have to make things easier for our kids, right? It is really, really hard to sit back and watch our kids suffer. I used to say, you know, your kid has to fail. And then I heard myself, and it's like, I'm a mom, you know, like, don't tell me my kid has to fail. It was not compelling to me. The military, who I talked to a lot for this book, says getting better faster. And I like that. So in order to get better faster, kids have to have the practice and the experience of meeting challenge. And so many of the kids that I see have been protected from being challenged, right? For example, your 8-year-old or 9-year-old walks down the block, and there's a dog down the block that all of a sudden is barking like crazy. And let's say your daughter comes home frightened by what happened, and teary and clingy and really upset. You know, I can't go back there. The dog is going to bite me. It's really scary. And we have a choice then. I think we have 3 choices. One choice is, you know, kind of too bad, you know, man up. Well, I said it was your daughter, but anyway, man up and walk past the dog, and you know, a tough attitude. And another attitude is, oh, honey, that must have been terrible for you. Let's go in the car from now on so you don't have to be afraid of the dog. And that lowers the child's anxiety temporarily, and it lowers your anxiety temporarily, right? Because we don't like seeing our children anxious. But ultimately, what does that do? It tells the child that they are not capable of managing an age-appropriate developmental challenge on their own, right? So the example is not being faced by, you know, 3 thugs who want to take their money, or, you know, something that you wouldn't expect an 8-year-old to be able to handle, but to handle the anxiety of walking past a dog that makes you afraid is something that a child has to learn how to do, right? And by taking them in the car, one, you've communicated the message that the child's not capable. And 2, you've robbed your little girl of the opportunity to see that she could master that situation. So there's this idea of scaffolding. You know, it's like you're there, you've provided a good foundation, you coach your child. You know, I'm not saying be indifferent. You could say, honey, you know, what would help you? And she said, I don't know, Mom. And then you might say, well, it might help you to remember when the dog barks that that's his way of communicating, and there you've walked past him 100 times and there's nothing to be afraid of. You can coach a child, but you shouldn't take over for that child, because now the next time she comes across a barking dog, she doesn't know what to do. She has no practice. And that idea of practice, I think, is really important, because we will all inevitably meet challenges, from the small to the large, in the course of our life. And if we don't develop ways to regulate our response, to control the visceral response, you know, I don't know how many of you have seen these experiments where you make people really nervous, and then you have a gorilla, it's actually a man in a gorilla suit, walking across the place that they're in, and they don't even notice it. Or you may have had the experience of jumping out of the way of a car before you really registered that there was a car coming at you. Our visceral response precedes our cognitive response. So the ability to calm down, to move from the part of your brain that's like anxious and scared, to the part of your brain that can think, from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. Kids need those experiences over and over and over again. And every time we get so nervous that we prevent them from having that experience. We're robbers. It's one less opportunity for them to learn to manage themselves. And I've often said we're much better at this with young children, right? We don't feel there's so much at stake. So I have two very little grandchildren now, and they're learning to walk. Well, one walks and the other's learning to walk. And you just watch a child learn to walk, and you're all about the child falls down and you're like, come on, honey, get up. And everybody's so excited and smiley, and kid gets up, takes a step, falls down on his butt again. And you're still like, oh, come on, sweetheart, get up. We don't say, oh my God, you're falling, let me help you, and make the child walk. And we don't say to our children who are babbling, this is stuff on my mind now, but we don't say to them, don't talk to me until you can talk in a full sentence, right? We enjoy the process of children, young children at least, learning to struggle a little bit their way through a challenge. And I think my experience in 40 years of psychology is that the vast majority of the kids that I see have not developed this capacity. When I was in graduate school, there was no such thing as emerging adulthood. Now emerging adulthood is a really big thing across the United States. There are very expensive programs to send your kid to if they haven't emerged yet. And part of me feels like this is just a delayed adolescence, because these are kids who never had a meet challenge. So I have another kid who didn't sleep alone at home. His mom was so worried about him, she slept with him till he was about 12. And then if he had a sleepaway, she'd have to come get him. If he went to camp, she'd have to come get him. He just didn't learn how to self-soothe in that case. And so he goes away to college and he's back within a week because he's never had a roommate. He doesn't know how to manage the feelings. And at that point, the feelings are really, really intense, and he needs to learn the adult skill of self-soothing and self-management. So emerging adult programs, I end up having to use them a lot because I see a lot of kids who should be able to manage their lives and they can't, right? And that's what these programs do. And I think that's a function of accumulated disability, of parents who have worried so much about whether or not their child is anxious, and usually mom or dad are anxious as well, that they don't allow that process of managing a challenge. And if I could advise anything, I like the phrase, you can do that, sweetie. My kids pointed out to me when they were young that I would meet them at the door and say, is everything okay? Every day. That was a function of my anxiety. It was not helpful to them. Your kid comes home from school now. Don't plumb for, was it okay? Did anybody get COVID? Were you scared? No, don't set the environment for anxiety and pessimism. Set it for optimism. How was school today? What'd you do that was really fun? Little kids do the rose and the thorn. Tell me a great, beautiful thing like a rose. Tell me something that you didn't like so much like a thorn. But and that's back to co-regulation. If mom or dad are home and feeling pretty good and did whatever they needed to do during the day, a little bit of breathing, maybe a little bit of meditation, maybe a little bit of just calling up a friend, then the child comes home to an environment that's optimistic. And we know that optimism is a protective factor. And just because it's on my mind, if you've listened to me before, I just talk about my family. So I'm talking to my granddaughter yesterday. She's 4 years old, and she calls me up to tell me that she did 2 mitzvahs. good deeds today. And, you know, you have these moments that are thrilling in life. That's a thrilling moment when your 4-year-old child, grandchild, niece, nephew tells you they did good things during the day. That's what you want to encourage. That's where, and right now, you want to put your energy somewhere, put your energy in congratulating your kid for the mitzvahs, the good deeds that they do. You know, don't worry about where they will go to school yet. I want to make sure that kids are psychologically grounded and connected. That doesn't mean they don't do their homework. It doesn't mean any of that. It's just a shift in emphasis. And our kids need to know that what matters most to us is not their grades, is not their performance, but is their mental health. And I think that our preoccupation with grades and, you know, all the parents that have my kid as an honor roll student on the car, it's really, I'm an honor roll parent. And we have boatloads. You can go on the Challenge Success website on our white papers and on our research about what happens to kids when that's the emphasis. So right now, the emphasis really needs to be on mental health and on connection, right? We know that kids who feel connected to their schools, and that doesn't mean that teachers, because I'm very careful not to give teachers any more jobs than they already have. So I'm not talking about turning teachers into psychologists, but the value of school connectedness has been shown to be so substantial. And that has to do with knowing a kid's name and saying hi and asking how Aunt Sadie is, who just had another baby or whatever. That's where our energy needs to go. And frankly, because I see this as a time of great reset, I think it's an opportunity for us to think about whether or not we had our values in the right place pre-pandemic. The number of kids that were being seen for anxiety and depression and substance use was awful before the pandemic. It was about 25% of kids, depends which numbers you're using. I think that's what the CDC uses. And during the pandemic, it was 40% of kids. We cannot afford to have 40% of our young people impaired or 40% of ourselves impaired. So I think you got to think about priorities. You know, you're juggling so many balls right now. Well, which of those balls are rubber and which are glass, you know, which you can afford to let drop for a little bit and which will break. And I make the case that what you can't afford to drop is your mental health and your child's mental health. And that those two things are tied up with each other. And, you know, co-regulation is so real to me. I used to be very afraid of flying. And how did I get through it? You know, I've been flying for years now. I watched the stewardess. And if the stewardess was just going about her business, which she always was, and it's turbulent, I borrowed her regulation. I'd look at her and it's like, oh, it's okay. I can be okay. That's what co-regulation is. And that's what we need to do with our children. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. I would love to take a couple of questions, and I think I've said what I have to say.
So once again, you've given me some things that I'm going to take away and put into use right away. How do I know when it's time to call in the professionals? I know this is a real issue for a lot of parents. We can handle this. It's not, and anyway, you know where I'm going,
Yeah.
Madeline.
So I think that is, and it has been a huge question, because knowing the difference between kind of a normal bump in the road and what needs attention is obviously really important. So, you know, what we do, what psychologists do, is its intensity and duration. So if you have a kid who has been in bed for 2 days and is kind of teary, I'm not ready to say that's depression by any means, but if that kid's in bed for 2 weeks, and 2 weeks is what we generally use, and and is crying constantly, or has, more often these kids have no energy and no, maybe they'll play a video game, but no enthusiasm for anything. Now, the issue, Guild, as we talked about a little bit before, is then trying to find somebody. So you say, okay, my kid is, been lethargic for weeks, doesn't get out of bed, I really need some help. I think where we're stuck is getting that help is very, very difficult. Now, that you have to try. And sometimes there are community resources that people don't think to use. But I'm just acknowledging that has become a challenge. I just referred a kid to Stanford eating disorders who are up. It's a 1-year wait. So that's a challenge. But in general, you're looking at intensity and severity. Any kid who's been in bed for a day or two, what I should say is every kid I know, including myself, spent a day or two feeling really crappy in the last couple of years. And a lot of people have called, like with a teenager, and says, she shut the door and she's not really talking. How long? For the last couple of days. Well, shutting the door and not being talkative is kind of normal for a 13-year-old, 15-year-old. So, not conflating kind of the normal way in which teenagers back off with mental illness, they're not the same. And nobody knows their kid better than their parent does. So if a parent says to me, even if it's only 2 days, and a parent says to me, I'm telling you, Madeline, there's something really wrong here, I take that very seriously.
The other day, we were talking about this, and they said, and expect challenges. What do you think they meant by that when they said expect challenges? They'll be coming.
As a general statement, expect challenges. So the very last talk I gave in person was here in San Francisco, and I had about 500-600 people at a school called Berks, big turnout. And for whatever reason, I asked, how many people have not had a divorce, a loss, a serious illness, a bad car accident, a financial crisis? And 499 people raised their hand, right? Because that's life. And one woman did not, out of this whole audience. Wow. And I said to her, be really careful when you walk to your car in the parking lot. I'm worried about you, right? Nobody gets away scot-free. So par for the course. Yeah.
Right. Right. Emily may have a question about middle school, high school. Is there something particular before Emily comes back? Something particularly of importance you want to mention about that middle schooler now?
I think middle schoolers had a really tough time. The two groups I personally think had the worst time were middle schoolers and early adulthood kids. And for some of the same reasons, actually, because those are both times when peers are incredibly important. So kids, and the other thing is time of great physical development. So kids left the 5th grade as boys and they came back to men. And, I had one kid say to me, like, they're all men. And that's disturbing to a kid. And they in that transition to middle school and then to high school, they missed an opportunity. The isolation for those two groups, I'm sorry, the isolation was tremendously difficult. Those groups really depend on a peer group in order to navigate the challenges of that particular time. So, frankly, the kids who did better, from my point of view, were the kids whose parents really tolerated and encouraged, even if it was riding a bike with a mask on, getting out of the house and doing something with peers. Yeah, my 2 cents about that group. That's a tough group.
Emily?
Yeah, I don't have a question as much as just a reiteration of just the importance. We are a pre-K 8 district here in the Glenbards, and I would agree with you that middle school was tough. But I really think the key takeaways for me that I want to reiterate is just that importance of belonging. We kind of restarted this year. Our whole theme this year in District 89 is you belong here, and you need to belong and be a part of something. So going back to the very beginning, that sense of purpose beyond ourselves is so critical. And we see it in the schools. We know that if you're involved in 1 or 2 activities, just 1 or 2, it doesn't have to be something every night of the week and every morning, and 1 or 2, you are connected and you have a sense of purpose. And I just really, that hit home with me as you were talking. And then that piece that just about that co-regulation, what we see modeled at the house is often what we will then internalize. And so that partnership between home and school is so critical. And what do we want our narrative to be? How do we want to be remembered? And just knowing how we regulate ourselves and how we handle this stress will directly impact our kids. I mean, I just feel like it can't be said enough. And you have a lot more experience in this area than I, and it's something we often talk about with our families. So I was glad to hear that today as well, that an expert in the field is also, talking about that as being such a critically important piece to all of this.
And you have probably seen more kids in your career than I've seen in mine, because you see hundreds.
Yeah.
And by the way, in terms of figuring out if a kid has a real problem or not, ask the teacher, ask the pediatrician.
Yep.
I've seen, I don't know, 100 kids, 200 kids, maybe. Pediatrician or the teacher has seen hundreds, if not thousands of kids. So they're usually a good a temperature taker of how a child is doing. Yeah.
I really appreciated your that accumulated disability. We've had a couple sessions here in District 89 over the last couple of weeks, and the importance of that parent partnership and really allowing kids. I love that reframing, not allowing them to fail, but allowing them to experience the challenge and to practice that experience. We know that with practice comes some expertise. And so we have to practice the challenging times too. And so I think that's so critically important. And that would be my takeaway from this for all of the parents on this call, is let your kids fight the challenge themselves.
Absolutely. And, I guess the other thing I want to add, well, how are we doing on time? We have a few minutes, is in the real world, right before COVID. So my book came out like 10 days before lockdown. And it was really about trying to make the point that what we're talking about, co-regulation and self-regulation and, meeting challenge, has become increasingly an important factor in hiring once kids get out in the world. It used to be that, it was pretty much a ticket. I had a dad say to me when I was talking about his kid and he wanted his daughter to go to Brown, and he said, Brown was great for me. Why would I not want her to go to Brown? And it's like, the operative word is me. It was great for me. Just this quick story, which I think Gilda knows, I took my son, I was meeting to get a mortgage, and I took my son with me because he was interested. This is my youngest son, Jeremy. And Jeremy was just being who Jeremy is. So I'm talking to this woman for 90 minutes and, my voice sounded like this. So he said, do you want some tea? I saw some, sure, honey. And then he says, the meter's going to run out. Can I put money in the meter? And I said, yes. And he turned to her and said, can I get you some tea? 90 seconds out of 90 minutes. And at the end of it, I get my mortgage, but he gets a job. Now, he knows nothing about him. Nothing. My jaw drops. he happened to be in his senior year of college. She didn't know if he was a drug dealer or a cum laude graduate. She didn't know a thing about him. So I, of course, was like, tell me about it. Like, you don't know anything about my son. And she said, I can teach him whatever he needs to learn. I can't teach him to be the person I want sitting next to me at work.
Yep.
So, and I heard that, you know, I like the story, it's a personal story, but I heard that over and over again from the head of LinkedIn, gave me the exact same line. We can teach. There some things that you need to be very proficient at, yes, but the vast majority of hiring now is on what we used to call soft skills, which I refuse to call them. So I call them foundational skills. And that's, you know, parents want their kids to grow up and get jobs and, you know, graduate and get a job and support themselves. And that has become increasingly important. So.
One last question, Madeline. This comes up often about parents hoping for some communication techniques that they can use with their child. And, you know, maybe it's the 2 ears and 1 mouth, but what do you suggest for them?
I always, yes, that does come up a lot. So the communication suggestion is listen. You know, I'm 40 years sitting in this office, sitting in an office. I have never heard a child say, my parents listen too much. Never, right? It's always, my parents don't listen to me. And so it's always phrased in terms of communication. It is communication, but people really don't know what deep listening is. You know, shrinks are always being asked, how did you find all that out from my kid? He never talks to me. I just was curious and listened. And so that can be very not satisfying for a parent sometimes, because his parents, it's like, oh, we know what to do. Just tell me the problem, I'll solve it for you. But that makes us feel better. And again, it robs kids of that opportunity. And the older I get, and I'm old now, so many of us have issues with anxiety. And I mean, anxiety is like a catching thing. And so being quiet and just listening, I think makes us feel like we're not doing anything. It makes us anxious, but you know, that's the clue. I mean, there are times as a psychologist where I've sat for weeks with a child saying nothing for weeks. Yeah, it's not easy until they were ready to talk. I'm not going to pound them on the head and say, I don't know what's going on and what are you doing here and you're wasting your parents' money. They will talk when they are comfortable, have something to say, and are trusting enough that they'll be listened to.
Absolute last question. What keeps you optimistic?
I have 2.5 grandchildren. I gotta be optimistic.
Right. That is so true. That is so true.
And I have, you know, 3 millennial kids, and they work hard. They have good values. They're committed, particularly to environmental issues. They've got juice, and I'm pretty optimistic about the rising generation. Not always so much about the older generation, but yeah. And you know what? There's nothing to be gained in being pessimistic. I'm a pessimist by nature. And you know, I've taken every course. I'm raising my optimism like this much. I'm that much more optimistic than I was, but it uses up energy that could be used in the service of helping, and that's what makes us feel better. So
beautiful.
That's what keeps me up.
This is one of the books. I still keep it next to my bed at my nightstand, and all of your books are outstanding. And it's always a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for letting us share this recording. It's really, really generous of you. And everybody who's listening, go tell someone else. At 7 o'clock, we'll be live here again with Madeline, and I hope you'll all come back and spread the word. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, ladies.